Saints Falcons betting preview. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the day. This is the time where we find winners. We've done this every single week, and we are on a bit of a roll. We have really kind of isolated the game scripts and found the winners, even as the Saints are on a 7-game losing streak. So we're going to do the exact same thing here today with the game that starts in, according to DraftKings, 23 hours and 47 minutes. Okay, so let's look at the line. Let's look at exactly how this line was kind of created. So the Saints, the look-ahead line, so the line that was before last week's games. So there's always a line that's set out before things happen, right? So what happened last week? Falcons beat the Cowboys in a kind of uninspiring win, but a win nonetheless. The Saints lose to the Panthers in what I would consider the most improbable loss in NFL history when you account for the fact that in every single other opportunity or example of that game state happening. So the Saints win turnover battle, they win the yards by 200, they win the YPP by almost 2, they win the time of possession by 10 minutes. Every other situation, teams were 275-0, and the Saints made it 275-1. Okay, so it is a loss, no doubt about that, but it's one of those losses where I think the downgrade might have been a little too severe because it was to the Panthers. All right, you factor in the Saints getting Darren Rizzi. So the Saints fire Dennis Allen. Darren Rizzi's the new head coach. The line goes from a pick'em to 3.5. Okay, so the Saints were downgraded / the Falcons were upgraded. A combination of 3.5 points, which is kind of crazy. So if you look across the betting board, it is now 3.5. So it says 3.5 across anywhere you look. It was 3.5. It was briefly 4. Okay, it moved briefly to 4. I believe 2 days ago on Thursday. Within an hour, it moved back to 3.5. So it means serious buyback was on the 4. All right, so we can assume the 4 is the high watermark. We can assume that 3.5 is, if 4 is the high watermark, I would say 3.5 is still a good play for the Saints. If we look at the bet splits, 75% of the handle and 84% of the bets. Remember, the number of bets is the actual bet. So $1 bet and $1,000 bet count the same. The handle is the money. So in that situation, $1,000 bet and $1 bet do not count the same. That is it would be hugely weighted towards $1,000 bet. Okay. So with that much money on the Falcons, the question is, why did it go from 4 to 3.5? All right. We know the answer. We just talked about it. So as far as a side, I like the Saints in this. I think the reaction was too much. I think the reaction was way too severe to go from... The Saints should have been downgraded. They lost. But they should have been downgraded from pick to 3.5 at home. If you look at the composite ratings, so the composite ratings have the Saints 24. And remember, this is a power ranking on the betting market. So you got like Neflo, Unpredictable, Massey Peabody, Unexpected, Fez, DVOA. The Saints are consensus 24. They are consensus 2.1 points worse than an average team. The Falcons, consensus 14, 0.9 points better than a composite team. Let's just make it 1 and 2.5 for easy math. So in this situation, on a neutral, this would have the Falcons as 3-point favorites. We'll just say, well, let's say 2 instead of 2.5, since it's minus 2.1. We'll round to the closest. So 2 points worse, 1 point better. On a neutral, you'd get Falcons minus 3. It's not on a neutral, and you do have to factor in the bump from Rizzi. I'm not saying it's a lot, but you do have to factor it in. So if you give the Saints, we'll say 2 points for home field, okay, this line should be Falcons minus 1. Should be right there. Falcons minus 1, Falcons minus 1.5, even Falcons minus 2. But to blow through the 3 to get to 3.5, and in some cases 4, which was immediately bought back, it shows that 3.5 is way too much. So I think the side, I am playing the Saints plus 3.5. If the Saints pop back up to 4, which I highly doubt it, but could happen at kickoff, I will be hammering the 4 as well. So love the side here for the Saints. If we look at DVOA, DVOA has the Falcons 14, Saints 21. Now the interesting thing is defensively. So defensively, Both teams have been pretty bad. All right. And the Falcons defensively, way worse than I think people realize. Like 21st and 23rd for the Saints. So two pretty rough defensive squads. Offensively, the Falcons have been good. The Falcons are, I believe, they're 5. They're 5 offensively. And the Saints are 22nd. But again, that's with multiple Spencer Rattler games. So the question is, how do we attack this? We've already seen the side. Now, DraftKings, the Saints are also minus 112. So they have a little bit of liability on the Saints at 3.5. Now, let's go to the props. The props is where we've really kind of been handling ourselves. So let's talk about the game script. What will the Saints attempt to do? The Saints will attempt to run the football. Last week, the Dallas Cowboys had tremendous success on the ground. They averaged over 6 yards a carry against the Falcons. The Cowboys have a horrific rushing offense. So if we go to the rushing yards, now the bad news is Kamara's rushing numbers will be skewed because he had 160 yards last week. So he had a tremendous game last week, which is going to push these numbers up big time. They're 70.5. This is DraftKings. So let's go ahead and look at BetStamp, see what we can do as far as props. Kamara rushing yards across the board, 69 at BetRivers, 70.5 everywhere else. So BetRivers 69.5. I'd play it. Now the only caveat is that if the game script is the Saints are trailing, this is going to hurt Kamara. Because obviously if the Saints are trailing, Carr is going to throw a little bit more. We look at the attempts, 16.5, a little higher in his attempts. I would stay away from the attempts just because you are playing a dog where if they are losing, it is hard to imagine Kamara getting the 17. But if the Saints do lead, if the Saints are leading basically at any point late in the game, this is going to fly over because they're just going to run the football and run the football and run the football. Now, passing is interesting because, like I mentioned, the Saints are expected to be down, okay? They're expected to be down, and they're expected to be trying to have to get themselves back in the game throughout. All right, not a huge underdog, but an underdog nonetheless. The Falcons are horrible at getting after the quarterback. Okay, so Derek Carr should have success in this game. The problem with that is who will he have success with? Because the wide receivers are hurt for New Orleans. The wide receiver group is now Jermaine Jackson, Marquez Valdez-Scantling, and Mason Tipton. So who's catching these passes, right? Like it should be a setup for Carr to have success. But can he take advantage of a weak Atlanta pass rush? If you look at these wide receivers, I would guess MVS is the one that's going to get the most work, but that's a complete guess because we haven't seen him utilized. We don't know, right? Like he's a new asset on this team. So we just don't know. I mean, 1.5 seems low, like 1.5 at FanDuel, simply because someone has to catch the ball. So if you go to Mason Tipton, he is at 2.5. Okay. So really think about how crazy this is. You've got Mason Tipton at 2.5 receptions. You've got MVS at 1.5 to 2.5. You've got, let's see some other people could possibly catch passes here. If you go to Foster Moreau is at 1.5. Okay, if you keep going to, where's Alvin? If you go to Alvin is at 5.5. Okay, that's expected. Alvin, he usually sits around 4.5 to 5.5, so that's not too crazy. If you go to Jermaine Jackson, our favorite member of the Jackson 5, he doesn't even have receptions listed. Like, think about that. You've got a game where Derek Carr is supposed to have whatever it was, 30.5 pass attempts, and the receivers cap out at 2.5 receptions. Someone has to catch passes. So, I would play them all. I mean, I would play Mason Tipton over 2.5. I would play MVS over 1.5. I would when Jermaine Jackson, when he gets receptions at some point, I'd play his over because Derek Carr is not going to end this game with 7 completions. All right, he's not going to end this game with 5-6 completions. Someone has to catch the football. So I would look at that as well. Blake Grupe is interesting because I think the Saints will have success moving the football on the Falcons, but without Chris Olave, without kind of a red zone threat, I could see them stalling out. 1.5 field goals could be something there. Let's see here. What else we got? So that's the immediate way I would look at hitting this is Kamara rush yards. Kamara receptions isn't crazy, but 5.5 is kind of a lot. 4.5 you'd love, but 5.5 I'm probably staying away from. Kamara to score a touchdown. Let's see, his rushing touchdown is only available at Fliff and Fanatics. Okay, interesting. Let's see, just anytime touchdown is somewhere in the neighborhood. So you can get minus 130, minus 135 at Caesars. It's probably the best number at like a realistic book. I'm sure most of y'all aren't using Fliff, ESPN Bet. So Kamara to have a touchdown is interesting. I would think Foster Moreau as well. Foster touchdowns, pretty nice. I mean, you can get 7-1 at MGM. 7-1 on Foster to get a touchdown. 7-1 at FanDuel too. Just because, like, who else is going to catch the ball? I mean, we just talked about this. Like, if Derek Carr's in the red zone, we've seen him huck it up to Foster against the Panthers. I would assume Foster's going to get plenty of looks in that red zone. Foster first touchdown might be interesting as well. But I'm hitting. Now let's look at Bijan. So Bijan is the other like kind of obvious game script, right? Because the Saints aren't great at stopping the run. The Falcons, if you follow the line, the Falcons should be leading, which would then mean they're going to run the football. Okay, let's look at what the Falcons do when they are leading. This is one of our favorite things to do. So if you look at, let's look at the Cowboys game. So if you look at the Cowboys game, Bijan got 19 carries, 86 yards for 4.5 yards per carry. Let's look at what happened against the Panthers. Or against the Buccaneers, excuse me. Against the Buccaneers, a little bit of a closer game, so it's a little bit of a different situation. But Bijan got 13 carries, Tyler Algier with 12. Bijan gets 63 for 4.8. Okay, let's see. Against the Panthers, a little bit more of a blowout. Bijan gets 15 for 95, 6.3, and Algiers gets 18. So Bijan should get, some workload there. Tyler Algier sitting at 8.5 rush attempts. So Bijan kind of seems like a play. Like he kind of seems like a play. I wouldn't do his attempts. 15.5 is probably okay, but I wouldn't do 16.5 just because they do seem to kind of not split carries per se, but they aren't afraid to, Bijan's not exactly like a bell cow 30 attempts kind of guy. They do move it around. So maybe Bijan's yards is the way to go. 72.5. So let's see. Let's get the old calculator out. So if we're assuming he'll average let's say he averages 4.5 yards a carry. Seems to be kind of close to his number here. But to get 73, okay, he would need 17 carries. All right. Which, again, like math lines up. Math does math. So do you think Bijan either A, gets 17 carries at his average, or do you think Bijan's average goes up? Is kind of what you have to factor in there. I would lean towards average going up because the Saints do have kind of a weak rush defense. So I would assume Bijan will be closer to that like 4.85 mark. So I would lean towards Bijan attempts at 15.5 and lean towards his rushing yards at 72.5. I mean, this is the rare situation where if you're going to play this, if you're going to play this, like it's worth downloading ESPN Bet and getting the 69.5. I mean, it's 3 yards. Like that's a lot. So, I hate like recommending stuff like this because it's so niche. Like I don't know anybody that plays ESPN Bet, so. But I'm not going to sit here and be like, yeah, play 72.5 when you can get a 69.5 if all you have to do is download an app, right? So take it for what it's worth. But Saints-wise, you have to look at Kamara, everything. Like, you have to look at his rush yards for sure. Rush attempts, again, I think is a little controversial yet brave because of the game state. Like, if the Saints are losing, he is not going to get 18 carries. But if the Saints are winning, he will absolutely get 18 carries. So the better way to play this, I think, is the Saints on the line. Like, Saints plus 3.5 is kind of hedging the rush attempts. So I would just play the Saints on the side there if it was me. But Alvin's yards, I think, are the way I would go. But the receivers is where I would just attack, because it seems like they don't know what to do with these numbers, and the numbers are just crazy low. Unless you believe, like, what's Derek Carr's completions? You know, like, Derek Carr's completions are 18.5, we'll call it. So if you think Derek Carr, let's just say he gets 18, okay? So let's say he goes under his completions. If he gets 18 completions, who are they going to? Alvin Kamara is not going to have 17 completions. So he has to find someone, some combination of Foster Moreau, Marquez Valdez-Scantling, Mason Tipton, Jermaine Jackson. Like, some combination of these players have to have receptions. And you've got Foster chilling at 1.5. You have MVS chilling at 1.5. So that's 2. That's 4. Alvin's at 5.5. Let's say it's 6. So that's 10. And then you got Mason Tipton at 1.5. That's 11 or 12. So there is a mistake somewhere in there, especially if you factor in the game script of the Saints should be losing. Okay, so I would absolutely look that way. A lot of variables in this game, but the bet I like the most is that 3.5 or that 4. I do like that quite a bit. I also do not hate the idea of playing, the first half you can find a 3 at Fliff. I'm not even sure what Fliff is. But getting a 3 in like the first half or the first quarter, you're not going to get a 3 in the first quarter, but if you get like Saints first half, because you would assume the Saints are going to be the most motivated, the most up, the most fired up in the first half. So playing the Saints in the first half, not a bad idea if you're kind of scared of the whole game, but it's just like one of those numbers where 2.5 is kind of disgusting, right? So something to look at there. But yeah, I mean, it's a tough one. It's a tough handicap. I know we kind of talked our way through it. I know we looked at basically everything on here, but directionally, I would go Saints 3.5. I would go Alvin rushing yards. I'd look at Bijan rushing yards. I would take a look at all those receivers we just talked about. Someone has to catch the football. You're going to get very little Falcons pass rush. Falcons have last week did not stop the run at all against the Cowboys. You would assume the Saints are going to get some kind of success on the ground, whether it's game script or not. But that's what I would do. That's where I would go. If you're looking at tight ends, so obviously the Saints kind of have this, but this is another thing where you gotta think about it, where Saints are bad against tight ends. Well, when you say that, you're talking about Dennis Allen's defense. This ain't a Dennis Allen defense anymore, right? It kind of is, but it kind of isn't. So a lot of that kind of stuff you got to throw out as well, but I wouldn't blame you. I wouldn't blame you for looking at Kyle Pitts receptions. If we look at Drake London notoriously is good against a man. So it depends on what you think the Saints are going to do. Again, we don't know, right? Like, Dennis Allen's gone. But 5.5 for Drake London. He is sitting at 59.5, 60.5, 61.5, somewhere in there. So, I mean, interesting game for sure. Difficult to handicap when you have stuff like this. But again, I'd probably lean towards Blake Groupie props. I'd probably lean towards Kamara rushing, and I'd hit those receivers. And Saints plus 3.5. So there you go. Let me know, ladies and gentlemen, what you're playing, what your best bets are going into this game. Hopefully the Saints perform well. Hopefully we do get that interim head coach bump. And I'll see you in the next video.